evening from New York. Only 48 hours ago, right-wing Republicans were hailing an eye surgeon's victory in Kentucky's GOP Senate primary as, quote, part of an American awakening that is taking place across the country. Those the words from Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina. But in our fifth story in the countdown, now that their Tea Party candidate has reiterated his long-held position that U.S. businesses should have the right to discriminate based on race, GOP lawmakers today all but silent. Who is this Rand Paul of which you speak? The new Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate from Kentucky, after holding Tuesday's victory rally at a private country club today, trying to explain away his criticism of 1964's Civil Rights Act. Last night, Dr. Paul, having told our own Dr. Maddow that he questions whether the federal government should be in the business of mandating that private business owners, you know, restaurateurs, shopkeepers, hotel owners, university provosts, cannot turn away potential customers based on skin color, a position that Dr. Paul has advocated not just to Rachel, but also to NPR in an interview with a Kentucky newspaper earlier this year and in a 2002 letter to the editor of the Bowling Green Daily News that was turned up today by the political blog Page One Kentucky. Dr. Paul having written in part about the Federal Fair Housing Act, quote, the Daily News ignores, as does the Fair Housing Act, the distinction between private and public property. Should it be prohibited for public taxpayer-financed institutions such as schools to reject someone based on an individual's beliefs or attributes? Most certainly. Should it be prohibited for private entities such as a church, bed and breakfast, or retirement neighborhood that doesn't want noisy children? Absolutely not. Decisions concerning private properties and associations should in a free society be unhindered. As a consequence, some associations will discriminate. Meanwhile, over the weekend, Dr. Paul also having weighed in on the Americans with Disabilities Act, saying that requiring businesses to provide access to disabled people is not always, quote, fair to the business owner. So how did the Republican nominee today try to mitigate all of this damage? Largely by blaming the liberal media. When in doubt, Dr. Paul telling listeners of right-wing radio this morning that the controversy is political theater dreamed up by the, quote, loony left. Earlier tonight, adding to CNN that it was the result of a news cycle that has gotten out of control. Meanwhile, Dr. Paul's Republican friends today all but pretending they had never heard of him.
Again, not being familiar with the context of his response or his questions, I really can't opine as to his position.
Okay, let's move on.
You have no comment on that?
Yes, I do.
What is it?
No, I support the Civil Rights Act.
What about the Americans with Disabilities Act? Rand Paul says he wants to abolish that as well.
I'm going to talk to Rand about his position.
Minority Leader McConnell, Kentucky's senior senator, who, to be fair, actively recruited and backed Dr. Paul's opponent, saying he is, quote, glad to hear that Dr. Paul supports the Civil Rights Act. Well, at least the sections that deal with the public institutions. By late this afternoon, the doctor issuing a similar statement declaring, purportedly unequivocally, that he, quote, will not support any effort to repeal the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Repeal the Civil Rights Act? Who, except perhaps Dr. Paul, is even considering any effort doing that now? Last night with Rachel, Dr. Paul having said that had he been around, he would have tried to modify the parts of the Civil Rights Act with which he disagreed. Earlier tonight, claiming to CNN's Wolf Blitzer that he apparently would have voted for legislation he believed was flawed.
If you had been a member of the Senate or the House back in 1964, would you have voted yay or nay for the Civil Rights Act?
Yes, I would have voted yes.
In response to a question about whether the private department store Woolworths had the right to segregate at its lunch counters in places like Greensboro, North Carolina during the 1960s, Dr. Paul tonight claiming that he believes federal intervention had been necessary.
I think that there was an overriding problem in the South so big that it did require federal intervention in the 60s.
We're joined now by the House Majority Whip, Congressman Jim Clyburn, the Democrat of South Carolina. Great, thanks for your time tonight, Congressman.
Thank you so much for having me.
What was your first reaction when you heard Rand Paul's views on the Civil Rights Act, and has anything that he said since during this day changed that first reaction?
No, nothing he said has changed the first reaction, which was absolutely astounding. I just could not believe what I was watching last night as I watched him respond to 14th Amendment questions with a Second Amendment answer. It was just incredible to me. And to hear him talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as if there is no 1968 fair housing law. I would like to know how he feels about that law. In fact, he wrote a letter, I understand, to the editor of his local newspapers opposing the fair housing law of 1968. What does he feel about the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that law that allowed me to be serving here in the Congress? I don't know that this guy isn't still parsing words by limiting his comments to one section of the 64 Civil Rights Act. It tells me that he's got problems with other laws that we've come to accept as a part of the American way.
Well, his defense today seems predicated on this. This was not an issue. This is merely a red herring, a political ploy. He blamed Rachel Maddow for the interview. And then the letter to the editor that you mentioned from 2002, he said basically the same thing. I mean, the quote that, I'll read this one again, read it once, but a free society, he wrote, will abide unofficial, private discrimination, even when that means allowing hate-filled groups to exclude people based on the color of their skin. Is that a red herring, or is this now a theme to a man's perspective on what's discrimination and what's not in this society?
Well, he was in the public arena with this attitude a long, long time, and I find it kind of interesting that other leading Republicans, to include the senator from my home state, have been out here pushing his candidacy, wanting him to be the nominee of their party for the Tea Party movement, to endorse him, for him to cloak himself in the Tea Party movement, set himself up as a spokesperson for the Tea Party movement. I think we'll now be getting a full picture of exactly what the Tea Party movement is all about. And so I think it's time for us to ask Dr. Paul what he thinks about things that have happened on Wall Street, because we had people doing oversight. What he thinks about what's going on down in the Gulf Coast, because we need oversight over oil drilling. He seemed to feel that his libertarian philosophy gives him the authority to push for a regulation-free society, a laissez-faire government, just people do as you please. This is the kind of stuff that got us in the predicament that we're in now. And I think that the people who voted for him should be asking for their votes back. The people who contributed to him should be getting their money back, because this guy is putting himself up as being something that I'm sure they had no idea that he was.
What is that? What word is apt to describe what he is that you're leading to?
I think that he is, in fact, a sort of laissez-faire government person. He calls himself a libertarian, but I don't believe he is that. I think he's something else, something that says people should be allowed to do as they please, except he has now said that about 50% of his practice is Medicare. But he wants us to, he's criticized his opponent for being for health care reform, and he wants to cut money out of the budget, but he thinks that we ought to keep the money there for doctors' reimbursement. That ought to tell people something.
Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, as always, sir, great thanks for your insight. Great thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.